Good afternoon. Welcome to this edition of the Coal Scene. Thanks for taking time to join us today. I'm Chris Hamilton with the West Virginia Coal Association, and I'll be your host for the next 25 minutes or so. Joining me in the studio today is Mr. Jason Bostic, Junior Vice President for the West Virginia Coal Association. Jason's going to be talking about some of the ongoing environmental, technical, and regulatory aspects of mining, some of the rules coming from EPA and other government agencies that are having an impact on coal mining here in West Virginia. Jason, thanks so much for taking time to join us here today.
Glad to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Appreciate it. I know it's certainly a big commitment from your day to come and fill us in on not everything that's going on. We don't have that much time, but certainly some of the highlights, some of the most important and pressing regulatory issues that's confronting the coal industry today. Seems like we hear a lot about EPA today, probably more so than any other time in our state's mining industry's history. It seems like, I recall somebody used a phrase a couple years ago, seems like they're coming by land, air, and sea. When you look at their regulatory program dating back several years ago now, when they appeared to be withholding mining permits, preventing literally thousands of miners from going to work, occupying positions at new operations, because of all the high marketing opportunities. To fast forward today, they appear to be just pressing forward with very serious and very threatening rules to control climate change or CO2 emissions from coal-fired power plants. I know we have there's an existing a rule that impacts new power facilities underway, and we're about to have a proposed rule on existing coal-fired facilities. So that's probably a pretty good place to maybe start and talk about that agenda here for a little while.
Okay. Chris, I think your characterization of EPA was entirely accurate. Several years ago, when you and I sat down, we were talking about EPA's interference in the mining process, the actual extraction of coal. And that's kind of where EPA and the federal administration started their assault on Appalachia and West Virginia. But here recently, it's moved from just beyond the extractive side of things to the consumptive side of the people that actually use the coal. And in particular, it's targeting coal used for electrical generation. And we have a whole suite of air quality regulations that are impacting the coal burning utilities in this country. And there are some rules that are in place. They've been challenged legally, but they continue to progress relative to their implementation. And those are for things like mercury and traditional air quality issues. But we also have pending a huge agenda, a huge outlay of time and resources by EPA relative to carbon dioxide emissions, as you mentioned. And it's really kind of the regulations, whether it's the existing air quality rules like mercury that we're dealing with, or the carbon dioxide regulations that we are anticipating. It's really an undertaking by EPA to reshape the energy face of this country. And it's going to drastically alter how energy and electricity is produced here, and seems to be having a targeted impact on coal burning utilities and as a result of that, coal miners and coal production within the state of West Virginia.
Excellent, great intro and background. I understand you brought a few slides with you here today.
I did.
That we'll put up and allow our viewers to take a look at as we continue our discussion. And I understand these slides are from a recent PowerPoint presentation that you gave here locally.
Yes. Chris, that's probably a good intro. The slide that the audience sees on the screen right now is probably a good way to establish the baseline of electric generation that we're looking at here in this country. And the black bar that you see on the chart is gigawatts of coal-fired U.S. electrical generation. In 2012, going back for several years, coal produced a little over half of all the electricity in this country. With some changes in the market, absent regulatory interference, that percentage has dropped a little bit. But if you compare 2012 to the red bar, which is the 2016 graph, you can see the impact of immediate regulations that EPA has already implemented relative to things like mercury control and the drastic drop in coal-fired generation. And when the folks in the audience read about power plants in West Virginia closing, including some that are relatively close to where we're at here in Charleston, like the Kanawha River plant up the river here, those plant closures are occurring as a result of the existing regulations relative to mercury. But the last bar on the slide, I think the slide may still be up there, it has just a large question mark about what the coal-fired mix of electrical generation is going to look like, because we don't know. And that's because of EPA's proposed carbon dioxide control regulations.
Interesting point. I know we've had several coal-fired generators already close here in the state, and I believe there's maybe two more scheduled for closure at the end of this year. Regionally, there's been several hundred coal-fired generators that have been forced to close. And as you indicate, there's a void on the generation side. But when you have a very weak economy like we've had, and when you've had say this last, so we can come back and talk about this past winter and how all those generators that are scheduled for closure were at peak capacity. But when you look at also the weather fluctuations and the relatively mild, unseasonal weather patterns that we've had the last 3 or 4 years, I don't believe we've missed that generation that hasn't been there, that generating increment because of those factors: weak weather, weak economy.
That's absolutely right, Chris. Unfortunately for EPA and the folks that are dedicated to that regulatory agenda, the American economy, nor have the weather patterns revealed the compromises or the chinks in their armor, so to speak, relative to these plant closures. So everybody was operating under the assumption that this massive amount of coal-fired generation could come off the market and the country wouldn't suffer. The polar vortex, or the extreme winter, however you want to refer to it, that we just went through, as you mentioned, most of the coal-fired assets that are scheduled for retirement, especially in the eastern part of the country, we're running at 89 to 95% of their capacity. So, the fact that we're going to lose those plants and there isn't a substitute electrical source ready to come online right now really casts a lot of questions about and causes folks to have a lot of general uncertainty about the stability of the electrical grid in the country. Because, Chris, as you know, the electric grid is a very fine-tuned piece of machinery and infrastructure. And you can't just take pieces off or take units off and add them on at will. The grid has to be very stable for it to function. If there's any fluctuation at all, the grid can go down for a particular reason in a cascading effect. And I think the folks, especially in the Northeast, saw some of those heightened concerns during the extreme winter weather, when for, I think, 53 consecutive days, the price of natural gas was higher than the price of crude oil because of a severe natural gas shortage that region was expecting, because the natural gas was being used to generate electricity because of coal plant retirements.
I guess all that's in flux right now and in transition as we go forward. The energy pricing models predict a lot of volatility. So I guess it's anybody's guess, where all that lands. But rest assured, it's going to result in increased cost on residential consumers, increased cost on industrial consumers as well.
Yes. Now, that's one of the most disturbing things I think that folks need to be aware of, even though electricity prices regionally and here in West Virginia have gone up over the last couple of years, coal is a relatively stable source of energy supply from a price standpoint. Natural gas, that's not always the case. Natural gas has been very erratic historically. And one of the hopes I think the entire country has with the discovery and the production of the Marcellus Shale play here in West Virginia and northern Appalachia, that would have alleviated some of the price variation with respect to natural gas. But if the latest winter that we just came out of is any indication, it didn't manage to do that. Natural gas prices fluctuated wildly. And some industrial users of natural gas weren't even able to obtain a supply because, again, because of stability concerns for the electrical grid, the natural gas was being diverted to utilities that otherwise may have used some of those coal assets to produce electricity.
The other item that's not readily apparent, people just don't stop and focus on it, and is that we've lost so many coal-fired plants in our surrounding states where we send daily supplies of West Virginia coal. So it's not only the 7 or 8 plants that have been forced to close here within our state, but I read where there were 30-some plants that were forced to close in Pennsylvania, 20-some plants forced to close in Ohio, 20-some plants forced to close south of West Virginia throughout the Mid-Atlantic states. These have there's a direct correlation, there's a direct impact on West Virginia coal jobs.
There absolutely is, Chris. And we have a slide somewhere in our deck there that illustrates the amount of plants that have been closed around the country. And unfortunately, as the air quality regulations, I believe it's the next slide actually, the air quality regulations kick in, there we go. That slide, those 2 illustrations, the top one shows coal plant closures around the country. The bottom illustration kind of represents the Kanawha Valley and the Ohio River Valley. But all the plants, if you take the eastern half of the United States, all those little yellow dots that you see, any of those dots that occurs east of the Mississippi, especially in the southern part of the country, in TVA service area, for example, most of those plants were entirely or at least partially fed by West Virginia coal. And those plants are being disproportionately, in my opinion, targeted for closure in some of these air quality regulations. So it's going to have a very, very tough, very hard impact on the coal we produce here.
Well, even though those dots that we see on the slide reflect closed power plants, those clearly represent regions of the eastern part of the country where West Virginia ships coal as well. I think we ship coal to every state east of the Mississippi. So even though those yellow dots reflect the power stations that have been forced to close, they also represent regions or territories where we send West Virginia coal basically for steam generation.
That's it.
Interesting. With those closed power plants also come a number of closed mines. We've been forced for a variety of reasons. It's not all EPA, but EPA certainly, has been a large influence. EPA's actions or inactions over the past 5 or 6 years on those decreased markets. Clearly so. Yes. Here in West Virginia, we're down almost 45 million tons of production between 2008 and the completion of last year, 2013. So over a five and a half year period now, we've lost 45 million tons of coal production.
Yes. Chris, and the slide that the audience should be able to see now is a breakdown of mine closures in the eastern half of the United States, and it's very apparent from that graph that most of the little dots that represent mine closures are in West Virginia, as one would expect, being the largest coal-producing state. But as you mentioned, Chris, it's not just air quality regulations. Market has a little bit to play with it, but EPA's interference in the permitting process for coal mines in West Virginia has a lot to do with driving eastern coal, Appalachian coal, out of the market. Because what it's had the effect of doing is making cheap energy expensive. West Virginia coal, because of its high heating value, because of its quality, has been able for years to compete with cheaper mined Western coal and with natural gas because coal was relatively inexpensive to mine here in West Virginia. It's always been more expensive than the other basins. But with EPA's interference, the regulatory costs have gone up so much that we have essentially been locked out of markets that we might be able to otherwise preserve even with the massive plant closures. But when you add several dollars to a ton of coal production to comply with EPA's interference, then you're going to lose that market share, either to natural gas or to cheaper coal production from another region.
And there's a clear negative ripple effect, just as there's a positive effect when you put a new mining operation in an area. It's just like a new factory or a new steel mill. There's a lot of ancillary businesses and the spinoff aspect of the economy that grows and matures as a result of that operation expanding. The reverse is also true when that operation begins to go down. And in the state of West Virginia here, with there being 100 or more fewer mines today than what there was just 2 years ago, and when you have 3,000, 3,500 miners, all of whom were making somewhere on the order of magnitude of $75,000, $80,000 a year, so times 3,500, 4,000. Not only do you lose all that payroll dollars throughout the economy, but you begin to see, the second and third and fourth tier of your economic base begin to erode.
Yes, and I think that's one of the things that you can observe by watching the state's budget process. With coal being impacted, as you mentioned, the ripple effects go far and deep in a state like West Virginia, where mining is such an important part of the economy. So the state of West Virginia has seen its fortunes fall along with the coal industry because, again, it's not just severance taxes, it's not just business taxes, it's the coal miner's personal income tax, it's the guy with the rebuild shop for mine equipment and his business tax and his personal income tax. So the effect is felt far and wide, I'm afraid.
I think it's been estimated that we have somewhere around $2 billion that's been removed from the local economy throughout the central and southern Appalachia, and that probably accounts for the job loss and lack of revenues and taxes in southeastern Kentucky as well.
Mm-hmm.
Next slide. I know there's another slide coming, and if you don't mind commenting on it.
Okay. So one of the things, we've talked about the existing rules and the mercury control rules that are already impacting power plants. But the big unknown to us right now as the coal industry, and I think as an entire country, is EPA's proposed carbon dioxide regulations. There is a regulation out to comment right now where EPA has proposed CO2 limits for coal-fired power plants just under what the newest, most efficient coal-fired power plants can achieve. And what that essentially does is if you need to sustain existing electrical load or you need to build a new plant, you're essentially going to have to go to natural gas. And again, one of the hopes that the entire country, I think, have is that natural gas prices would stabilize from their historic volatility. But that hasn't happened as this winter has bore out. One of the things that we wanted to show the audience today was a comparison of electricity prices for a West Virginia resident versus natural gas prices. And again, as we mentioned earlier, you can see the recent uptick in the cost of electricity. And even though West Virginia is 98% coal-fired electricity, there was some price increases as the utilities installed new pollution control equipment. But if you look at the green line compared to the red line on that graph, you can see that natural gas prices show a lot of volatility. And we wanted to do that because if the only option for new electrical generation capacity in West Virginia or any other part of the country is natural gas, then I think the consumer as a whole needs to be prepared for price volatility on their electric bill, which is something that we have not seen here in West Virginia historically, again, because of the 98% coal-fired capacity.
The new rules, what's the timetable for implementation of the new CO2 rules?
Okay. You have two sets of rules. You have a set of rules for new coal-fired power plants. That's the 1,100 pounds per megawatt hour of CO2 that we mentioned earlier. That rule was proposed earlier this year. It's currently open for public comment. The comment period closes the 9th of May, and after that, EPA will take the rule back, review the comments, and probably finalize that sometime in the fall of this year. So after that rule becomes final, if you're going to build a new coal-fired power plant in the United States of America, you're going to have to deploy some level of carbon capture to meet that 1,100 pounds per megawatt hour of CO2 emission standard.
And that's the technology that really is not commercially available.
That's right, Chris. This proposal from EPA, for the first time, in my opinion, in the history of the Clean Air Act ever, EPA has presented an incomplete regulatory picture. They have told industry, the electric utilities, you have to control carbon dioxide from a coal-fired power plant without having a system of technology readily and commercially deployable for utilities to use. In the past, with other controlled technologies, be it sulfur dioxide for acid rain concerns or anything else, the technology was adequately demonstrated and adequately proven. With carbon capture and sequestration, there are but a handful of pilot scale projects that have been deployed. There is a project currently under construction in Mississippi that would capture carbon from a lignite-fired power plant in this case. But that technology, again, has not been fully deployed, and it's not readily or commercially available because that plant's receiving a great deal of federal subsidies to install that technology. So what we are faced with is this incomplete regulatory picture. You, the power generators and the people of the United States, you need to control carbon emissions from your power plants. But we're not exactly sure how you're supposed to do that.
You know, it's interesting, if I may also just add, that we had a relatively small scale test site here just north of Charleston, in New Haven, West Virginia, I believe.
The Mountaineer plant.
The Mountaineer plant. And they were very successfully removing carbon dioxide through their very, very small scale again. But, you know, that plant was, it was producing some results. It was becoming full operational, but then for some reason EPA removed, or the federal government removed, you know, their share of the funding, which was, you know, really expensive, I remember.
Yes. CCS technology, again, because of its novel nature at this point, is extremely expensive and it's extremely complicated. You know, if you capture carbon dioxide, and the purpose, again, EPA's premise is you need to control carbon dioxide because of some threat to the environment. And we could probably debate all day long about whether or not that threat exists or not, but EPA and the federal government assumes that it does. If you're going to control it and capture it, you have to have some place to put it. And in the case of the Mountaineer plant and pretty much everything else that we've considered relative to CCS, that involves injecting that captured carbon deep underground into some of these deeper geologic formations. And that raises the point again of the incomplete regulatory picture. You know, if you're going to inject something underground, you have to have adequate regulation to control what happens to it if it gets out, who's ultimately responsible for it, what if you cause like an aquifer contamination or something like that. And EPA hasn't even tried to address any of those questions.
I suspect there's just
it's really frustrating.
A zillion legal issues and legal challenges confronting that technology as well that need answered, need sorted out.
That's right.
So that pretty much takes care of the timeline and proposed rule as it relates to the construction and permitting of new power facilities, coal-fired facilities. How about existing? Is there a companion rule that will govern existing plants?
Yes, sir. We, along with the EPA's obligation, I say obligation, it was an obligation put on them by the President through a climate change action plan that he announced over the summer, earlier in the summer last year. The EPA has to develop rules for existing plants. And what we anticipate right now, as we head into the summer, EPA will propose for initial comment a set of regulations to control carbon dioxide emissions from existing coal-fired power plants. They will be, just like the current rule for new plants, there will be a comment period. EPA will review the comments and issue a final rule, but existing plant standards are a little different than new plant standards. For existing plants, the real burden on how to implement those standards falls with individual states. In this case, it would be West Virginia and our Department of Environmental Protection and its Division of Air Quality. So once EPA finishes the existing plant standards in June of next year, of 2015, then they will issue guidelines to the states. And the states will have to craft plans to implement those federal standards and have them approved by EPA in June of 2016.
So just to recap, it seems like there are triggers or dates by which something's going to happen from the regulation tied to the next 3 Junes.
Yes.
Here in a couple months, June 14, the rule will be proposed. It'll be finalized June 15, and compliance will have to take by the states will have to occur June 16.
Yes, sir. Yes, we're looking at a multi-year implementation approach here, but unfortunately, as you know all too well, the need to generate electricity doesn't wait on regulatory guidelines or regulatory deadlines, so to speak. So what you have here are the next 3 or 4 years of relative uncertainty for anybody that needs to build a new generating facility, which is just going to throw the energy market and the electricity market for the country into an uproar. But we are facing, again, probably 3 to 4 years of not necessarily battle, but comment periods in dealing with regulations as they're issued by EPA. And now with the existing plant standards, individual states will have to enter that fray to preserve the generation that they have.
As we already mentioned, the concern, potential threat, from a cost standpoint and economic security standpoint, the concerns are shared. They're shared, by businesses, by individuals outside of the coal industry. I know the state's Business and Industry Council is very active, communicating on behalf of its members and in concert with its members, the concerns that they have over potential, utility rates and the impact overall on the state's economy. I know our governor and our state's attorney general, our legislative leaders, have also been quick to express their concerns.
Yes. And Chris, I think the other observation we probably need to make is, having options available in a fuel mix is always a great thing. If you look back at the energy history of the United States, if you will, when we have done poorly, it's because of single fuel sources like oil for transportation. So bringing natural gas and renewables along with coal into fuel electricity is a wonderful thing. It's just we don't want to place entire reliance on a single source of fuel.
That's a great point, and that's probably a good place to break. We're going to continue our discussion of this issue in the months to come. Jason, thanks so much for taking time to come by here this afternoon. And I want to take a moment and thank all of you for taking time to join us on the Library Television Network today. Thank you.